Welcome back to Viet History Makers with my co-host Kevin Pham.
Welcome back, everyone. So today we have an interesting episode, another one. Our last two episodes were on Ho Chi Minh, and we talked about how Ho Chi Minh had a theory of anti-colonial revolution and communist revolution. And today we're going to turn to someone named Nguyễn Mạnh Tường, and he's going to offer criticisms of Ho Chi Minh's ideas, essentially.
Kevin, I know that it took you a long time to research this new figure because you kind of like reached out and you said, hey, we got to switch courses because we got to balance out the conversation. And I know it takes a lot of time on your part. I'm just here just to ask questions as a student. So I'd like to ask the audience to help us with, supporting what we do.
Yeah, I mean, that's very much appreciated. Again, I work in cafes, and if you find these episodes to be helpful or interesting, then it would be appreciated. Some donations, buy me a coffee, buy Ken a coffee.
And then this is for the YouTube platform.
Right, you could buy a super thanks on YouTube, right?
That's right. Yeah, I think it's a super thanks on YouTube. On the audio platform, I think there's a donation on the Red Circle platform, but we've never asked for it, but might as well ask now. And, if it ever shows up, which I haven't seen it, but if it ever shows up, then we'll do it. We'll accept it.
Let's think back to Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh comes back to Vietnam in 1941 after being abroad for 30 years. He leads the Viet Minh, and they defeat the French at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. So Ho Chi Minh's goal of ending colonialism is achieved in the North. Today we're going to ask, what happens after that? What happens after anti-colonial revolution? Well, now the Viet Minh are going to turn to their project of building socialism in the North. Now that they've achieved national liberation, a question for everybody, for all anti-colonialists is, all right, how do you make political freedom last in your newly independent country? How do you make it last? So, of course, there's still going to be another war against non-communist South Vietnam and their American backers. But in the North, the question was, now that we're free from colonialism, how do we create a socialist state? So the listener might think of this episode as kind of like part 3 of our Ho Chi Minh series. And we're going to turn to Nguyễn Mạnh Tường. Have you heard of him, Ken? Nguyễn Mạnh Tường?
No, I mean, I've heard of his name, but I have never heard of his significance or his contribution.
In my view, Nguyễn Mạnh Tường offers the most compelling criticisms of the way the communists were doing their communist revolution in the 5 years after Dien Bien Phu. So he's going to criticize the communists for becoming too authoritarian, too dogmatic, too conformist. And so we talked about how Ho Chi Minh has a paternalistic theory of revolution. Well, Nguyễn Mạnh Tường is going to say that paternalism is harmful to human flourishing. And he's very philosophical. He thinks very deeply about this. Yeah.
Before you get into all this, I heard you pitching Nguyễn Mạnh Tường to me and why we should talk about him. But before we even get into him, don't you think that whenever there is a new regime in power, that it really is just human nature to go so hard on the enemies and the previous people, the way to control? I mean, in any government, I mean, you look at worldwide, once you take power as a new regime, that you're just going to go really hard. You're going to kill people to stay in power. And that happens, I think, all across the world. I mean, and we don't know how much it takes place in the United States, because that's just, it's done under the cloak of the night, dark nights, like we don't know what really happens. But in order to control and to maintain the power that you just have taken over, these things happen. So to hear that there was a critic, it's just, I wonder how much of the critique is something new to critique a power change or a regime change. Like, was
Absolutely.
his ideas new?
Well, that short answer is not really no, because throughout world history, human history, whenever there is a revolution, often afterwards there's a civil war. For example, the Russian
Yeah.
Revolution. After that, you had the Red Army and the White Army. Vietnam is another classic example. In the last episode, we talked about how Ho Chi Minh has a theory of revolution, and he has the idea of a dictatorship of the proletariat, meaning democracy for the people, and I'm putting quotes around the people, while at the same time being repressive against your enemies. And so we also have to remember that Ho Chi Minh's brand of communist revolution was Stalinist. Stalin had a very different view of communist revolution from, say, Trotsky. So in 1945, the Stalinists, the Vietnamese Stalinists, repressed and killed Trotskyists. So we also have to remember that communism is also a very diverse tradition,
Mm.
where in Vietnam, Stalinism um, kind of became the main the strain of communism while repressing others, right? So for Ho Chi Minh, you got
Communism is not a monolith.
it's not a monolith. It's absolutely not a monolith. And I mean, for example, just in the Russian case, you have Rosa Luxemburg, who is a Marxist, but she's going to fiercely criticize Lenin and Stalin for being too dictatorial, top down. Like, she doesn't like that. She thinks communism should be an experiment among the people, bottom up, free speech and all that. So there are many different kinds of communists, but the kind that Ho Chi Minh is going to lead is Stalinism. Nguyễn Mạnh Tường is also the last thinker that I discuss in my recent book, which is up here. You can see in the YouTube video, The Architects of Dignity, Vietnamese Visions of Decolonization, published, now it's been last September by Oxford University Press. And I have to admit, he's one, I'm going to say what I think here. He's one of my favorite thinkers. And there's a reason for that. And I think it'll become more clear in this episode. But by the way, listener, if you find these episodes interesting, I highly recommend my book. It's extremely accessible, no complicated jargon. I think you'll enjoy it. Okay, let's jump into Nguyễn Mạnh Tường. He is a very, very impressive intellectual. In my view, he's the most intellectual of all Vietnamese thinkers that I can think of. He's the first Vietnamese person to earn 2 PhDs from France, one in law, one in literature. And I learned of Nguyễn Mạnh Tường through Yên Vu, my very good friend and my co-host of Nam Phong Dialogues, our podcast. So she gave a presentation on Nguyễn Mạnh Tường in Paris, and I was in the audience, and that's how I met her. I went up to her afterwards because I was so interested in Nguyễn Mạnh Tường. And by the way, just our Nam Phong Dialogues podcast, in our last episode, we discussed Vietnamese Marxist intellectuals Trần Đức Thảo and Nguyễn Khắc Viên. So if anybody's interested in other Vietnamese Marxist intellectuals, you should check out that episode. So anyway, today we initially were going to talk about Nguyen Van Thieu, one of the presidents of South Vietnam, because we wanted to do an anti-communist figure, and we will do him later. But for now, I wanted to focus on how a Vietnamese intellectual, not a politician, criticized the communists. Let's review a little bit before we just jump into Nguyễn Mạnh Tường, because that will help us a bit. So in the last few episodes, the last two, we focused on how Ho Chi Minh presents the problem facing the Vietnamese. He thinks the problem is capitalism and, by extension, colonialism. And his solution is a communist revolution led by a vanguard of leaders. And these leaders, he thinks, were supposed to cultivate what he calls revolutionary morality, which is a mix of Confucian virtues, so that the leaders can win the hearts of the people and guide them towards socialism and then communism. Remember that for Ho Chi Minh, the most important thing a revolutionary can do is criticism and self-criticism. And what this means is he thinks the leaders should criticize the Communist Party and criticize themselves. and to point out mistakes in a friendly way. That's how you do revolution. You identify mistakes and then you say how you're going to correct them. Because, of course, human beings are not perfect. And so mistakes have to be uh, rectified. So, this is a technique developed by Stalin and by Mao. So, Mao Zedong has many quotes about criticism, self-criticism. He portrays it as a kind of purification, like our face gets dirty. We have to wash it from time to time, you know. So this is going to be relevant for our discussion of Nguyen.
When you say he's among the right the your most beloved, most respected person in the Vietnamese sort of thinkers, I mean, does that give any indication to your political sort of leanings? Or I mean, why I just it just triggered that in me.
This is great. This is great. It's gonna, well, I'm gonna let the audience decide that for themselves. But one thing I should mention, Ked, I wanted to bring up to you is that I found it rather amusing that when we did our episode on Ngo Dinh Diem, many people praised it. They were very appreciative, but some people seem to personally attack me for sympathizing with Ngo Dinh Diem. And then when we did our episode on Ho Chi Minh, some people personally attacked me for sympathizing with Ho Chi Minh. So I think we're doing something right here.
Yeah. Viet Nguyen says if both sides are not attacking you, you're doing something wrong or you're not doing it right.
I do like that question, though. Why do I like Nguyễn Tường? And that'll become clearer later in the episode. So let me jump into his biography. Nguyễn Tường was born in 1909 in Hanoi, and he learned French at a very young age. And in 1925, he attained his baccalaureate in philosophy. He then goes to France in 1927. And through a scholarship, he studies law and literature at Montpellier University. And in 1932, he became the first Vietnamese to earn 2 doctorates in those fields. So, and then from 1933 to 1936, he travels throughout Europe to London, to the Netherlands, Brussels, Berlin, Athens, Rome, Istanbul, Vienna, Madrid. And then he returns to Vietnam in 1936. And in Vietnam, he teaches French literature. And then he leaves teaching and he becomes a lawyer in the late 1930s and 1940s. Now, this becomes interesting here. From 1945 to 1956, so this is the whole period of the First Indochina War, he receives praise from the Communist Party. Why? Because he had devoted himself to the anti-colonial and revolutionary cause. So he donates to the party three buildings that were his family's heritage. So he's going to give up his own family's property for the cause here. In 1946, Ho Chi Minh personally asked Nguyễn Tường to prepare a government position paper to be used at a conference with the French in Dalat. And then from then on, like, Nguyễn Tường is part of the underground resistance against the French. In 1951, he was asked by the Communist Party to join the party officially. But what he does is he actually refuses to join the party. But eventually he agrees to join a different party, but under the umbrella of the communists. So he joins the Socialist Party of Vietnam. Now, still, the Vietnamese Communist Party is going to rely on Nguyễn Tường to represent them at international conferences in Beijing, in Vienna, in Brussels in the 1950s. So the point is that he's quite
Tell me why. Can you tell me why he did not agree to join the Communist Party and he agreed to do the socialist one?
I think that that's a really good question. And I think that might become clear later on. I mean, we can only speculate here, and I have my hunch. But let's go back to that question later, because I think the answer will become clear as we discuss his ideas more. Okay, so his prestige with the communist authorities just continues rising, actually. So in 1953, he gives a speech in Vienna, and this speech is radioed to the world, and he's urging intellectuals all over the world to support the resistance in Vietnam, the anti-colonial resistance. And for this, the communist authorities appoint him to be professor in Thanh and later a professor in Hanoi. The party also puts him on 10 executive committees. Now, something dramatic happens in 1957. His life takes a sharp turn when the Communist Party puts him through a series of trials. So, what happened? Well, let me remind listeners that something big happens in the communist world. In 1953, Stalin dies. And after Stalin dies, we begin to see in the few years after that what we call de-Stalinization in the communist world. So in February of 1956, Nikita Khrushchev, who's the leader of the Soviet Union, he gives a speech that just stuns the communist world. He denounces Stalin. The speech, Khrushchev's speech, was given in a secret meeting, but the document leaks out, and then soon the whole world knows about it. Okay. And then the Vietnamese communists, they tried to hide it, but the northern intellectual artistic circles still know about it because they can read French. And so French newspapers fall into their hands. And so in this speech, Khrushchev essentially says that the mistakes during Stalin's reign was due to this cult of personality, where the communists exalted a leader into a living saint who could understand everything in the world and solve everything for everyone without ever making mistakes, right? So this atmosphere of that starts to oppose and criticize the Communist Party starts brewing in this de-Stalinization mood around the communist world. So what happens is that in October of 1956, Nguyễn Mạnh Tường gives a speech at a conference in Hanoi. And this is the moment that changes everything for him, because this eventually leads to his excommunication. What that means is that you're banned from society. And it leads him to become one of the leading figures of this movement called the Nhân Văn-Giai Phẩm movement. And that movement calls for greater freedom of speech. So in this speech in 1956, what he does is he addresses mistakes made during the land reform campaign, which we've talked about on these episodes, and he calls for legal and democratic reform. All right. Well, did we really talk much about the land reform? I don't think so. Let's do some review.
No, we did not. Yeah, we did not, but we have touched upon it, but we didn't really get into it though.
Right. Well, I mean, the important thing to say here is that from 1954 to 1956, the Communist Party in the North implements land reform, which essentially is taking land from landlords, perceived landlords, and redistributing it to poor peasants, perceived poor peasants. But in this process, a number of people were humiliated and executed, and they were later found out to be innocent and as poor as anyone else. And this will be admitted to leaders of the campaign themselves. So there's fallout of this land reform. And this becomes an important turning point. According to one person, Bui Tin, more than 10,000 people were killed, most of them party members or patriots who had supported the revolution but were reasonably well off. By the way, the numbers are wildly controversial. You're going to see.
Yeah.
The important thing to talk about here, though, is that the party recognizes mistakes and in a series of speeches, and they undertake a program to rectify errors. And so Nguyễn Mạnh Tường essentially takes up this invitation, right? So the party is going to say, look, we've made mistakes. So Vong Nguyen Giáp famously says, we've made mistakes, and it's time to talk about it. And so they encourage intellectuals to speak out. Shortly after, in China, you're going to see a very similar thing. They call it the 100 Flowers campaign, where intellectuals were encouraged to criticize the party. Mao Zedong eventually jails and punishes those intellectuals who speak out, and a very similar thing happens in Vietnam. But that happens later. But what happens now is, so Nguyễn Mạnh Tường takes up this invitation, and he gives a speech where he criticizes the party for its lack of democracy and rule of law to protect individual rights. Now, what happens is that the party leaders, they claim to have no problem with his criticism. They say, look, we welcome your criticism. But their issue was that Nguyễn Mạnh Tường speech was leaked to the rest of the world and into the hands of the enemy, the capitalist enemy. His speech had fallen into the hands of Vietnamese correspondents who later sent it to Saigon, where it was published in full in papers. So his speech is being used by non-communists and anti-communists in the South. And this is important to emphasize because Nguyễn Mạnh Tường never says that he's anti-commun. He's not he's criticizing communists, but he's not criticizing communism. That's an important point to point out. In his writings, he's going to say very positive things about socialism, and I'll say more about that. But his speech was exploited by capitalists to further attack communists and communism, and party leaders said this is a major problem because criticism is supposed to be done in private. You know, if you have anything bad to say about the family, you get in the huddle. Like this is what Malcolm X would say with Black people in the United States too. Don't air out your criticisms for our enemies to exploit them, right? Now, following this, he's banned from practicing law, and from 1957 onward, his life it's really sad. He's isolated in Hanoi. He's excommunicated. So in his own words, he says, quote, I was kicked out of all the places I was working, and the cruelest thing was isolation. For decades, no one dared to come see me. Now, I'm moving quickly in time here. So what happens in 1989 is the party, he says, for the first time in history, announced the birth of liberalism. And then he writes, I took advantage of the opportunity to apply for a passport to go to France. And so he didn't think that his application would be approved because of his political past. But then he says, quote, to my great surprise, in just 2 months, I had a passport and a visa. So he goes to France. He's welcomed by his French Vietnamese friends, and they do interviews with him. He gives talks at universities and TV stations, and he dies. And he goes back to Vietnam, and he dies in 1997 at his home in Hanoi. And let me just briefly talk about some of the things he wrote. He wrote a lot, and I can't touch on everything here, but he wrote a memoir in French called En excommunié and excommunicated. And this memoir describes his life in isolation in Hanoi from 1955 to 1991. It describes how he criticizes the party. And he also wrote essays and books in French that talks about the East and West. So, for example, he wrote this book called Sourire et l'âme d'une jeunesse in 1937. So, Smiles and Tears of Youth. And this book features stories of young Vietnamese who lived in France, and then they either chose to stay in France or return to Vietnam. And he describes this internal conflict that they experience as individuals who are torn between two cultures. So that's one clue of why I like him, okay? I also feel like an individual torn between cultures, so I can relate, right? But okay, so that's the brief bio.
So
any thoughts?
I have 1,000 questions. So he basically was only in his probably 30s when he was, writing. So he was banned from society, from the Communist Society in like around 1957.
Right.
So he was in his 30s, mid 30s or so, right? So for the next 30 years before going to France, did he have any?
Wait, hold on. No. So he was born in 1909. So he's quite in 1957. How old is he? I mean, he's like
40 something.
Yeah, 40 something.
Okay,
right.
So he was.
He's not.
So he was fully formed. He knew what he was doing and going to get himself into. I mean, at the possibility of probably being put to death, and they probably, I'm wondering why they spared him. That's the big question.
Yeah, yeah. All right, this is so fascinating. So, okay, let's jump into this discussion here. I mean, to me, he offers one of the most powerful intellectual criticisms of authoritarianism. And so let's talk about this. How did he criticize the communists? I'm going to start with this scene that I think is so moving, I think. So let's start. Okay, it's one morning in Hanoi in 1957, and he's at home and he hears a knock on the door. He opens the door, and who does he see? It's his friend who happened to be in the government, the Communist Party. And the friend had come to inform him that the authorities in the Communist Party had decided to imprison Winmento, to incarcerate him. And so I mean, imagine that. Like he's like, well, that's the rest of my life, right? I'm 40 something years old. I'm going to spend the rest of my life in jail. What's really interesting here is that he describes his thought process. He says, at the moment, I I considered hiding, but then I quickly decided against it. And I'm quoting him here. He says, the police have put its agents, spies, and informers everywhere. Besides, such an attitude seems degrading to me. I would feel as if I were renouncing my conviction and ideas. What would the communists who used to pay homage to my dignity think? Isn't this like, what are your thoughts here? I mean, like, to me,
High level,
it's
high level thinker.
right. And somebody with dignity, right? He doesn't want to degrade himself. He doesn't want to go into hiding. He wants to stand up for what he thinks is right. Right. So that's admirable. So then, okay, he thinks he's going to go to jail. So what he does, and I love this part, he begins gathering his essential belongings. He walks around his house, and then he picks out things to take in a suitcase. And so he says, quote, I am resigning myself to my fate. And in anticipation of a journey without return, I fill my suitcase with underwear and woolen clothes. And he looks around his house. He wonders what else to bring. And he says, he decides on one book to bring with him for the rest of his days. And he says, quote, I also put in a copy of Montaigne's essays from the Pleiad collection. Together with paper, pens, ink, and pencils, I want to occupy my forced and endless spare time with some kind of intellectual work to save myself from the insanity of imprisonment. Perhaps my jailers will have the humanity of not taking away this viaticum of which I greatly need. So, Ken, when I first read this, I was just blown away. I was very moved. You know why? Because my favorite philosopher of all time is Michel de Montaigne. If I was dying, if
Mm.
I only had, if I was on my deathbed and I could only have one book, it would easily be Michel de Montaigne's essays. Let me talk about Montaigne and why I love Montaigne. So Montaigne was a 16th century French philosopher, and he's famous for inventing the essay. And the word essay in French comes from the verb essayer, which means to try. And what Montaigne did was he was the first really to turn inward and to examine himself, really, the internal contradictions of himself. And he's famous for being a skeptic, for arguing that humans actually don't know anything. Like our ability to use reason is actually quite limited. And those of us who have so much pride in our reason, we actually end up doing really horrible things, because we have to keep in mind that Montaigne was writing during the wars between the Catholics and the Protestants all over Europe, where they were killing each other because each side thought that they possessed the truth and that the other side was not only wrong, but stupid and evil and deserved to be killed. So Montaigne was a Catholic, but he also had friends on all the different sides, and he would literally go on horseback and be a mediator between these warring sides. And so
Wow.
his philosophy is going to be like, look, we need to turn inward and doubt ourselves. We change all the time. for fun, he's going to take the perspective of something that he totally disagrees with. And so he's going to change his ideas all the time. He's also famous for talking a lot about the human body. Philosophers had never talked about our body. Like, we are animals, essentially. A lot of philosophers before him thought that humans were much better than animals, and that actually led them to become arrogant, Montaigne thinks. But Montaigne is going to bring us back to the body. I love Montaigne, and like, he's very funny, very, yeah, I could go on for hours.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's great. It's interesting. Last night I was with a group of friends and we are talking about how when we go inward throughout our entire day, human beings, we're just recycling the same thoughts. It's rare that we're thinking about new things that change us. It's rare that we can come up with our own method of change unless you read something, unless you get kicked down from a breakup, or if you're in a situation where you're facing really hard, punishing situations. That's kind of the only time that you really find yourself into change. And I think when we talk about like the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s, Martin Luther and the Catholic Church, and then you think about Nguyễn Mạnh Tường and his role in critiquing the Communist Party. These are times when thinkers are faced with these major dilemmas that allow them to really face their own integrity. But I wanted to ask you, what were the main things that Nguyễn Mạnh Tường was he critiquing about the communists at the time?
Yeah, let's turn to that. Great. So right before I get into that, let me ask this question though. So Nguyễn Mạnh Tường had a large collection of literature to choose from for his only book, right? In prison, what he thinks is going to be a lifetime in prison. Why did he choose Montaigne's essays? Well, a clue is in the way he refers to the essays. So I had mentioned he calls it a viaticum, the last Eucharist for a dying man. So Nguyễn Mạnh Tường, this is really sad to him because the Viet Minh had expelled the French, finally, right? The French were there for almost a century, and Nguyễn Mạnh Tường was looking forward to creating a new Vietnam with his compatriots. But now he faces the prospect of a life alone. So what he's going to do is he's going to turn inward to himself. He's going to bring along Montaigne. And so Nguyễn Mạnh Tường, he never goes to prison, actually. He never ends up going to prison. In the end, what happens is that some leaders high up in the party decide against incarcerating him, likely because they're like, look, Nguyễn Mạnh Tường, he was a revolutionary, he's an anti-colonialist, and he had
He's one of us.
sacrificed. Yeah, and he had, sacrificed his family's property and so on. So what they decide instead is to permanently excommunicate him from society. But for Nguyễn Mạnh Tường, excommunication is not that much more preferable than prison. So he says, quote, "In my personal case, no sentence was imposed on me, neither prison nor a cell. But in the communist city, there are unnamed informal punishments that amount to a long-term death sentence. Such is the case of excommunication that political fanaticism has taken from the arsenal of medieval criminology. Excommunication is the most decisive weapon of religious fanaticism. No believer is allowed to house, feed, or clothe an excommunicated who has been deprived of shelter, sustenance, clothing, and who cannot lead his life normally." There are already clues in this passage right here. We see that he's referring to the kind of communism in North Vietnam as a sort of political fanaticism, like a religious fanaticism. It's almost like something religious, One time, so I showed my students the Internationale, like the communist anthem, right? And I asked my students, "What do you notice about this anthem?" And almost all the time, I have some students who say, "It almost seems religious." Like there's something very spiritual about it. And so, as we know, people, I'm not at all saying that religion is bad, not at all, but we do have religious fanatics, of course, right? So Nguyễn Mạnh Tường is going to say that what we're seeing is a kind of religious fanaticism. So how does he criticize the communists? So he shames the communist leaders for what he thinks is their regressive, unmodern, anti-democratic, and religious-like fanaticism. So he thinks that Vietnam was becoming not a democratic republic as its name purported to be, but rather a cult. So members were believers and non-believers were banished. And anyone who helped non-believers were also considered enemies. So what he does is he's going to promote a kind of liberal ethos in response to this very strict kind of discipline, dedication, resoluteness, and ruthlessness that he saw animating some communist revolutionaries. And this is really interesting because when you're trying to fight against the French, like you need discipline, right? You need to shut your mouth and get along with the program and fight the French, right? But after you kick out the French, many of those fighters were like, okay, we did it. Can we relax now? Right? Can we relax our social bonds? We had been disciplining ourselves to tighten our social bonds into a fist to punch out the French. Now look, let's relax and let's have free speech. Let's engage in literature and art and poetry. Let's think for ourselves, you know? And so he is going to talk about all this in his memoir, And Excommunicated. He wanted to see this memoir published in French and in Vietnamese, and so, but what happens is that he publishes it and he expects the worst. Like he is expecting the party to jail him again, but he says, if that happens, I will do a hunger strike until death. But that never happens. And so he says, at 84, I have known the best and the worst of life and have no regrets about leaving this life during which I fulfilled my duty as an intellectual before the people and before history. So one thing I want to talk about here is this is really, really important for anybody interested in Western philosophy, because if you ask philosophers, when did Western philosophy start? They will almost always say the dialogues of Plato. So Plato wrote the Republic, and the Republic is essentially dialogues with Socrates. And I want to talk about this for a moment because it's really important. So the trial of Socrates is very famous. I don't know if you ever read this, but so Socrates is on trial. Socrates is this guy who walks around Athens in ancient Greece, and he essentially interrogates people. He asks them questions for why they believe things they believe. And he just keeps on asking them questions until they make a contradiction. And then he essentially exposes them that their beliefs actually rest on nothing but sand, right? The point is that most people who have really strong beliefs, when you keep asking them questions, a lot of the time they don't really know. They have never really reflected about why they believe in what they believe. And so Socrates was accused of corrupting the youth. And so he's sentenced, he's put on trial. And then at the trial, eventually the Athenians, through a democratic vote, they vote for his execution. And what's interesting is that he's sentenced to death. And the custom in Athens at the time was not to like kill somebody, like by shooting or by like, hanging them or beating them. No, the person had to drink the poison, the hemlock. And that's significant for Athenians because they prided themselves on persuading people, not on using direct violence. So they had to persuade Socrates to kill himself, and he does. And what's interesting about the trial of Socrates, the main point, I think, is that Socrates could be seen as a hero, right? Here's this man who stands up for what he believes. He only aims at finding the truth, and he doesn't care what happens. He's only seeking the truth. That is
Right.
what a philosopher does. The philosopher cares about no politics, nothing else, just only the truth. However, what happens next is in this dialogue called the Crito. The Crito takes place a few weeks after Socrates' trial. So now Socrates is in jail, and his friend Crito shows up and he tells Socrates, "Hey, Socrates, I can sneak you out of jail and you can go to a different city. We could save your life. You don't have to kill yourself." How does Socrates respond? We see a very different Socrates from the apology of Socrates. So the apology was during the trial. But in the Crito, Socrates says, "No, I cannot run away because I must be loyal to the city of Athens, because Athens raised me. This state uh, made me who I am. How can I run away? I made an agreement with them that I would kill myself, and if I um, you know not follow through on that agreement, then that would be being disloyal to the state. I owe my life to the state, and so I need to follow through." Now, a question for you, Ken. Do you think that Socrates is here contradicting himself? Because it seems like in the trial of Socrates, or it's called the apology, the defense of Socrates, he seems defiant. He's like, I will, yeah, I will seek the truth and kill me, go ahead. But in the Crito, he's now saying, no, I need to follow through the laws. I respect the laws. The laws made me who I am. I must follow through. I must not um, fight against Athens. Do you see a contradiction here or no?
I kind of don't see that. I don't think that there is a contradiction. I think that there actually is just one line of integrity. I mean, that's how I feel. I haven't
Yes.
really had time to really think it through, but I don't really think that there's a contradiction. If you follow the line of integrity, I think he's right on the money.
Right, right. And the reason why I'm bringing up these two dialogues, the apology of Socrates and the Crito, is that we might say that it highlights a tension between philosophy and politics. In philosophy, your aim is the truth, to point out uncomfortable truths. But in politics, that's not your aim. You kind of need to get along with the program. You need to shut up and not cause problems, Like in politics, you have a political goal. And so if you question things too much, that might diminish the power of your group, right? So it's a tension here. And the point of all this is to say that Nguyen Mạnh Tường sees himself as a kind of Vietnamese Socrates, that now that the French are kicked out, he thinks what Vietnam needs is philosophy, is truth seeking and self seeking. And so now let me go back to his excommunication. He's painfully lonely. He has trouble finding work. So he's always hungry, and he's always trying to figure out what to sell so that he can buy food. And it's really sad. Like he takes all his books and he sells them to like get pulped, like to make paper. It's really sad. And so he sees himself as like Socrates, like this victim. And Socrates tried to encourage the youth to think critically, but was ultimately condemned. And so he's going to say, quote, "Since Socrates, we know that when the city wants to condemn an intellectual to drink hemlock, it accuses him of corrupting the youth. Communism has therefore revived a practice that dates back to more than 2 millennia." So he thinks that a Vietnamese Socrates is needed to counter the conformity and lack of critical thinking that is being promoted by what he thinks is the authoritarian state. So he says, historically, the autocracy has dreamed of molding the people, especially the youth who bear the future in its image. As a result, the youth are educated with every political line. The school is charged with the mission of training those who tomorrow will assume their responsibilities in the city. It's therefore important that the teacher trains his student to become executors of government policy. Any deviation committed in education has the same gravity as a deviation from the political line proclaimed by the leaders. Okay, now this is interesting because he's talking about education. How are the communist leaders going to form the new generation? Are they simply going to indoctrinate the youth, or are they going to create people who can think for themselves? But the challenge for the communists is, how do you create people who can think for themselves, but will also be socialists?
I don't think that they align. I don't think those two things align.
Well,
I find it hard. And I think this is speaking to everybody in the diaspora and people in Vietnam right now. I think you can't have it both ways. I'm sorry to say that. It's very difficult to fall into alignment and be obedient to a philosophy or a mode of government, and at the same time think for yourself. And I think in the United States, we see this play out over and over and over again. And it's why we fight. It's why we have two very loud, extreme sides of these parties, is because we are allowed to fight and voice our opinion and really get dirty with each other here in America. And I think, I don't really, I'm not really advocating for one way or another, whether Vietnam has it right. There's harmony generally with the people. And I think, falling lockstep with the Vietnamese government, creates a peaceful society right now. And then I think in America, we're experiencing a lot of chaos. So, but I don't think the two systems can work. It can't. It's just no way.
So this is interesting. I mean, Nguyễn Mạnh Tường emphasizes that he's criticizing communists, not communism. Now, we might have a debate on, like, was he really, supportive of communism or not? Was he just doing this rhetorically so he wouldn't get in trouble? But he's framing all of his arguments as an attempt to improve the party, not destroy it. So he's going to say that they lack intellectual seriousness. He says, those who quote Marx have not read him. And if by chance they happen to take a peek at a page in Capital, so that's Marx's famous work, they don't understand anything. He says, the best proof of this is that the enthroned Marxists commit tremendous errors from which the people suffer, which raises doubts about their knowledge of the doctrine on which they rely. So he says, and I'm going to quote him, those who quote Marx have not read him, and if by chance they happen to take a peek at a page in Capital, Marx's big work called Capital, they don't understand anything. The best proof of this is that the enthroned Marxists commit tremendous errors from which the people suffer, which raises doubts about their knowledge of the doctrine on which they rely. So this is quite amusing. He thinks that the solution to dogmatism in the Communist Party is for the communists to actually read Marx and to try to understand him. And so Nguyễn Mạnh Tường thinks that there could be a good relationship between the communists and the intellectuals. So he says, quote, communist culture forms man for the revolutionary struggle. Intellectual culture forms man for thinking and research. But the communist culture must not annihilate intellectual culture. Between these two cultures can be peaceful coexistence, and better yet, a beneficial collaboration for the respective interests of the two groups and for the entire people.
You know how I've always thought to myself, these ideas that are formed by the founders of nations, the founders of whole movements, I think they set out with really good intentions. Whoever came up, the founding fathers of America, the founding fathers of Roman Catholicism, the founding fathers of, Vietnamese communism, everybody came from good places. But I think over the years, the corrosion of power, the consolidation of power corrupts because there's loopholes that develop over time, and there's just leaks in these systems that over time can't contain the happenings, the goings on of the society. And I
Yeah.
think that's what we all experience.
This is good. So Nguyễn Tường is very similar to another important philosopher named John Stuart Mill. And both of them are going to argue that the biggest problem facing their societies was conformity. Simply that people don't think for themselves, like they don't think critically for themselves. Essentially, they're anti-intellectual. They repeat what they hear. And then if you ask them, why do you believe in that? They don't really know why. Like they can't defend it on their own. And they don't know the arguments of the other side. And so John Stuart Mill is going to say, you should listen to people that you disagree with. Even if they're wrong, it will do you good because you can then know why they're wrong and know why you're right. And if they have some truth on their side, then you can add their truth to yours and improve your truth, right? So Nguyễn Mạnh Tường, he says, this is a really fascinating passage. I'm going to quote him. He says, I open Montaigne. It is my breviary, my viaticum. There are so many good lessons that the communists can learn if only they were cultivated. Through the healthy example of the ancients and of Montaigne, they could have learned that one should not lodge anything in one's head by mere authority and trust, that anyone following another follows nothing. Translated clearly, this means that one should not kneel before anybody, neither Marx nor Lenin, neither Stalin nor Mao. This is really interesting. Would you describe this as an anti-communist passage?
No, it's just I don't think it's anti-communist. I just think that it's find integrity and go and find your truth and use the logic from your truth to govern yourself. I don't think it's anti-communist. I don't know. That's
Yeah,
how
and
yeah.
yeah, and I think he would agree. What he's criticizing now is people who call themselves communists. So he says the communist mind, quote, is narrow and happily ignorant of others it can otherwise learn from. It carries out an operation which is completely its own. It marks out a small area of land and digs deep without worrying at all about what the neighbors are doing. Thus, the dogmatic mind is closed off to different perspectives, which otherwise would, when rubbed together, polish and strengthen the mind. So he thinks that what the communists need now is to essentially engage with other ideas. And this is very Montaignian. Michel de Montaigne took great pleasure in traveling and learning about the diversity of the world. People live in different ways, they have different lifestyles, they have different customs. And one custom is just simply different from others. It doesn't mean that just because somebody has a different custom from you that you're better than them. It's just you have different ways of doing things and that you can enrich yourself by learning of different people's customs. So Nguyễn Mạnh Tường says, quote, the Vietnamese must neither shut themselves up nor lock themselves in a closed world, but open themselves to the commerce of men. By the way, I'm quoting for the listener who's not watching on YouTube. There are so many quotes here, and each time I quote, he's actually taking a quote from Montaigne. So he says, the Vietnamese must open themselves to the commerce of men, rub and polish our brains by contact with those of others, enter into this vast world, scrutinize where we should look for to find out the good angle, and thus, with the pieces borrowed from others, one must transform them and mix them up in order to turn them into one's own work, namely one's judgment. The gain of our study is to become better and wiser. This, in brief, is what the communists should have learned in order to form themselves before governing others.
And frankly, I think that when you think about Montaigne, when you think about Nguyễn Mạnh Tường, they're really just critiques, the critical of the things that are not right. And I think you can really apply their sort of critiques to any time in history of mankind and government. So is he anti-communism? Is he anti? I think he's just having these real serious discussions about what is wrong during his time.
So him and the other members of the Nhân Văn-Giai Phẩm movement, often they are characterized as dissidents. Some historians call them dissidents, and a dissident is somebody who opposes the ideas of, but I actually would not call them dissidents, because they present their arguments as, look, we're also communists, we're also socialists, we just want to help you correct your mistakes. And so he says that the party has become too paranoid, and this is actually self-destructive. So he says that the party is committed to a truth, and anyone who questions the party's truth is seen as not only wrong, but hostile. And then the party starts to see enemies everywhere, even where there are none. So he says, quote, "The ongoing slogan reminds us that the enemy is everywhere and hangs up his creatures anywhere. Maintaining general security requires vigilance in a state of alertness, the sending of professional spies to all meetings, the mobilization of amateur or volunteer spies to wander around continuously in the streets." So essentially, the party has become so paranoid that it's just spending a lot of money on spies. And this is wasting a lot of resources that could be going elsewhere. And he says during the land reform.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I think that's what makes a weak country. And I think you could see that in America today. The paranoia. I think if you're not on my team, you're against me. Whereas I think when we were growing up, there was a healthy amount of the ability to debate each other and to really point out what you felt was right and what you felt was wrong, even if the other side was going to strike back. And that is kind of going away today, I think, in the environment that we're currently in. And I think that is really a sign of weakness of a country, is when that kind of paranoia and fear exists.
Right. That if somebody says or challenges your idea, you immediately see them as an enemy rather than a friend.
Yeah. Or, why can't you see him as somebody who's really trying to have constructive criticism to make the country better? But instead, I think when you consolidate power the way it's done, all over the world, and you really execute the opposition, I think that shows, I think a lot of countries today are facing that. We're regressing in a weird way. And it's not just, I don't think it's just relegated to Vietnam and the 50s and 60s and 70s. I think it's programmed in humankind. And I think the more we talk about it and the more we discuss it, we aren't so foreign to this idea that paranoia takes over and it becomes one way, and the cycle of trying to get back to where we can debate each other on a it's like a family, right? If we're afraid of each other,
but I might
very
but Ken, I think there might be one difference, for example, between the Vietnamese communists and the Americans here, which is that the Vietnamese communists were engaged in a socialist project. Like, there was a social goal. There was like an aim for society. We are going to construct socialism. And when you have a social goal, then you can talk in terms of mistakes. Look, I'm just trying to criticize you because I want to rectify our mistakes. But do Americans have a kind of social goal? One criticism of liberalism, which is the ideology of individualism in America, is that there is no social goal. The idea of liberalism is that the government is more or less neutral and everybody is free to figure out their own goals. We're all separate individuals and we respect each other's personal aims, but we don't have a big social goal. That's something for the communists. That's why the communists are illiberal. So I think one difference might be is that the communists can speak in terms of mistakes. Do you hear the word mistakes being used in American political discourse? We don't talk about mistakes,
No,
do we?
we don't.
Right,
We
right.
don't. And you don't hear about social goals, really.
Exactly. That's my point. Right. Because that's our ideology, liberalism. We leave people alone. We don't have a social purpose, a broader meaning for why we're here, right? That is something that liberals are, I think for good reason, actually, skeptical of. Now my own politics are coming out, and you might be able to tell that I'm kind of torn, actually. On the one hand, I think that what's that?
You said you are what?
I think I'm sometimes torn. I'm like Montaigne. I go back and forth. On the one hand, I think the liberal notion, idea that we should leave others alone and pursue our own good is a good thing. I sometimes like being left alone. Like, don't tell me what to do.
Yeah.
I don't like authority telling me what to do and what to think.
Yeah.
But at the same time, that could get too extreme, and you have no sense of solidarity. You have no sense of collectiveness. You have no sense of society. You're just atomistic. You know what I mean?
Here, I think for me, this conversation for me, this is how when I think about social constructs, I like the idea of liberal, societies. Do whatever you need to do. But this is where I kind of have a problem, is when power and money is consolidated so strongly at the top. It feels like the final stages of capitalism. When the system allows for money and power to be consolidated so abundantly at the top, where everybody, the 95% at the bottom, has completely lost control of their lives, and everybody is working to support the very top, then it becomes a situation where that's why I think revolutions happen, because when people feel like they are not included in the overall like societal schematic, then we have an issue. And I think that's it. I think we should find a way, society should find a way to let everybody do whatever they want to do. But as long as somehow we can find a way to not let consolidation at the top happen so fiercely, then I think we have a good system.
I mean, this is absolutely, yes, this is a question for revolutionaries also. I mean, for the communists, this is what they saw. They saw wealth being concentrated in the hands of landlords and French colonialists, and they saw themselves as needing to take up their historical mission, their role as a working class, to overthrow capitalism and transition to socialism. But then once they got rid of the colonialists, you have all these intellectuals in the North who are saying, okay, how do we transition to socialism? And Nguyễn Mạnh Tường is going to say, well, it's certainly not going to happen if we're all non-thinking conformists, because what happens is that we become fake. I want to turn to this part because this is quite interesting. He says, he essentially thinks that human personality, individual personality, is just being destroyed. So he says, quote, all of Hanoi offers a spectacle of a puppet show or of mimes where people gesticulate, have fixed looks, they play deaf and dumb, they act like robots driven by springs hidden inside the body. But behind the scenes, in the rooms at the back of the shops, this is really special. So he says, in the rooms in the back of the shops, it's called Area Boutique. On the sidewalks, in conversations between two people, the ironical pretenses come back to life. The face regains its expressive mobility. Smiles are lit up in the eyes and bloom on the lips. And to take its revenge on prolonged silence and deliberate inertia, people thrash about like the devils, burst out laughing by mimicking the tone or mania of a leader. Okay, this is so special to me, I think. So essentially, he's saying that in Hanoi, in public, people are just nodding their heads. They're bowing to the leaders. They're faking smiles, but they're being fake. The moment they're behind closed doors with their friends, they're suddenly themselves again. Their true personalities, their true thoughts finally come out. And he uses a metaphor here that is really special to me because it comes directly from Montaigne, and I have a tattoo of it. So the term is arrière-boutique, which means the back of the shop. Montaigne said that everybody needs an arrière-boutique, a private space where we are free from the pressures of the outside world. There are people trying to make us think this way or that way, but we need our own private space to think freely for ourselves and to weigh, to conclude for ourselves or to think, to explore without feeling pressured. And so, actually, during COVID-19, my brother, he tattooed that on my leg. It's a Montaigne chateau. So Montaigne was 37 when he retired from his job as a mayor near Bordeaux, and he retired to his castle. By the way, he was totally bourgeois here. He retires to his castle. He spends the rest of his day, his years, writing essays about himself in this beautiful library by himself as the wars of religion are happening. But that's what I would like to do. But
Wait, so tell me about this tattoo. Your brother is a tattoo artist?
yeah, by the way, listener, my brother is a successful, very good tattoo artist, Alan Pham. He tattoos at State of Grace Tattoo in San Jose. He also tattooed my dad, which I don't know if I told you, but he tattooed during
No.
COVID-19. He tattooed the South Vietnam flag on my dad's arm with a silhouette of the Trung Xuan, which is the boat that my dad left Vietnam on April 30, 1975. So it's the silhouette of the Trung Xuan with the date, April 30, 1975, over the South Vietnamese flag.
How do you feel about that tattoo?
I think it's great. I mean, to my dad, it's meaningful, right? It's very
Yeah.
meaningful. And the flag is very meaningful to him. However, and I'm not going to go too deep into what my dad thinks, but I mean, yeah, I'll say it. I mean, my dad was upset when January 6th happened. And at January
What?
6th, my dad was upset when January
Yeah.
6th happened. And at the January 6th insurrection riots, whatever you want to call them, Vietnamese people flew the South Vietnamese flag. My dad has a yellow Mustang that he transformed into a giant South Vietnamese flag with the he put 3 red stripes on the yellow Mustang. So when we go
Wow.
to when we go to Westminster or Southern California, when we drive on the street, Vietnamese old people will stop and salute us. But
Wow.
after January 6th, my dad called me and he was like,
Retired the car.
well, he was like, look, I'm so shocked and upset that that flag was flown at January 6th. Should I take it off my car? And I told him no, because that flag means something to you that might not be the same meaning as somebody else. And so you should, keep it. And that car has led to various conversations with like American vets, for example, leaving letters on his windshield and stuff. So anyway, we're moving away from this conversation here.
It's
Um,
very cool.
yeah. So I just want to quote Nguyễn Mạnh Tường on the Area Boutique. He says, "Oh no, sorry. This is actually Montaigne's quote. He says, we must reserve a backshop all our own, entirely free, in which to establish our real liberty and our principal retreat in solitude. Here, our ordinary conversation must be between us and ourselves. and so private that no outside association or communication can find a place. So anyway, now I think I
yeah, go
can
ahead.
go. No,
No,
go
go ahead.
ahead.
No, go ahead, go ahead.
I'm just going to close off this part on Nguyen Tung and say that when Nguyen Tung's memoir On Excommunié was published in France in 1992, there was a Vietnamese person named Vo Van Ai who wrote in the introduction that the mistakes recounted in this text in October 1956 continued to be committed in Vietnam in this month of March 1992 regarding corruption, waste, contempt for the public, totalitarianism, and oppression. The reader can easily compare the text of Nguyen Minh Tuong to the hundreds of examples reported in the official press of 1992. Nguyen Minh Tuong did not advocate the brutal overthrow of the communist regime. Rather, he was only modestly asking that this regime be deeply reformed to have the genuine rule of law, a truly democratic regime. That's pretty interesting, right? That was written in 1992.
Today, how does the Vietnamese government view Nguyễn Mạnh Tường?
Glad you asked. So, when I was doing research on Nguyen Minh Tuong for my book, I saw on Facebook that there was a transcript of a 3-hour long interview with Nguyen Minh Tuong. It was shared thousands of times on Facebook. And looking through the comments, thousands of Vietnamese were saying that they lamented his fate and they praised him. They said, "We need someone like Nguyen Minh Tuong today in Vietnam." That's what I saw.
But the government, we don't know what the official position of the government is?
Um, I'm not sure if I think there might have been some conferences about Nguyen Minh Tuong and some people. In short, I don't know. I don't know what the government says today. I should just
God,
Google
I
this and
would
find out.
yeah. I would, every time I hear about these kinds of stories, I would do anything to be a fly on the wall and it be in the back rooms of the government's huddles, like to be able to
Yeah.
witness is there what kind of infighting happens? How are politics sort of ran, in a very top down government system, where, in some of the parliaments around the world, people are basically like fist fighting and it's totally fine. It's like, they get into physical fights like in Taiwan or sometimes in Britain. And
Yeah.
people tell each other off in the US Congress. And I wonder what it's like truly like behind closed doors in the Vietnamese government.
You know what? Okay, I mean, I just did the Google search. Okay, now I remember. I mean, I wrote about this in my book, but I've already forgotten. But yeah, I mean, it's what one might expect, which is that the government today admires Nguyen Minh Tuong because he's an impressive intellectual, and he is
Right.
portrayed as a patriot and an intellectual. So that's what they say. I mean, they're not going to bring attention to his criticisms, right, of the
Yeah.
party,
Yeah.
but yeah, no, I'm seeing it in Thanh Niên, a newspaper, for example. Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful. Are we going to pursue who we talked about last time is Nguyen Van Thieu for our next episode?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Let's do that.
Okay, wonderful. That will be I mean, if you think that whoever the follow-up will be most natural for us, I'm open to that figure.
Yeah, let's do Nguyen Van Thieu. I mean, we did Ngo Dinh Diem, and Nguyen Van Thieu is is going to be president until April 1975. Now, technically, he's not going to be the last president of South Vietnam because there are going to be like a few presidents after him for like a few days, maybe even a few hours, right? But let's talk about him. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, and I will be talking to you very soon.